Hello and welcome to my channel. Bonjour et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and today I wanted to try something a little different. So a fellow booktuber called Rachel decided to do for the Vlogmas event a video tracing her reading history, and what she does is for each year of her life on this earth she takes a book. Now the way I understand it, the book is either something that really stuck out to you during that year of life, or it's a book that symbolizes something about your life. I mean, I think it's pretty flexible as to how you can select the books, and I thought that was a really cool idea. Now, I was a bit concerned because I was like, how the hell am I going to do this? Because I didn't really start reading as a hobby, as something that gave me pleasure, until fairly late in childhood. And as far as memories of being read to as a child, I have extremely few of them. Also, I've only started religiously keeping track of the books I read since about 2016. And even then, the book log I currently have, where I put in the dates I start and finish a book, that one goes back only as far as the end of 2017. So I've spent the entire bloody day racking my brain and trawling through, boxes full of diaries I've been keeping since I was about 12 for, entries about the books I'd read, and I did find a few of them, thankfully, but they're not terribly, specific date-wise, so I kind of had to do some guessing work, and I plonked it all on my Goodreads account too. So it's certainly been an interesting exercise in brain maintenance, at least. It's also been a bit, I'll admit, difficult at times because reading through some of my old diaries was at times very cringe-inducing, and that did not feel so good. But it was all for a good cause, this video. And I'll be cutting up the video in sections. I think it's easy to do it that way, or at least it's easier for me. So first I'll go through what I call infancy years, 0 to 5, then childhood, 6 to 10, then what I call puberty, 11 to 14, then adolescence, 15 to 19, then young adulthood, 20 to 24, and adulthood, 25 to 27. I am currently 27. Anyway, let's start. So, year 1. Unfortunately, I have nothing to show you because I neither have a physical copy of the book and I couldn't find it on the internet, I'm pretty sure, even if I tried. But I do have a mental image of it. It was a book to teach very young children to learn words, basically. It's like a word book. It's not even a story. And I remember, I don't remember from when I was 1. Like I said, I'm approximating all this. I'm not even sure that my mum read this to me when I was 1 year old, but I had to put something for year 1, so I'm going with that. But I do remember that book, so she kept it for a while, but then I guess she got rid of it. So, a word book in French. I only started being spoken to in English when I was about 2 or 3, because my parents wanted to make sure I had a good base in French. And then, when I was 3, I went to kindergarten and I learned to speak French with my peers, and so they could concentrate on English at home. So for year 2, I'm going to go with a book. Again, nothing to show for it, unfortunately, and I don't even know what the official title of this book was. It was a book of fairy tales, I think, because, so I was trying to rack my brains to figure out how I was going to do this video, and out of nowhere popped this image. I have this very faint memory of a thick book, hardcover with a dust jacket, and it was filled with all these little fairy tales and folk tales, like, 100 of them, just one after the other in that big book. I can't even remember if it was in French and English, actually, but I do have, a scrap of memory of that book. For year 3, I'm going to go with the Peter Rabbit books by Beatrix Potter. I don't have them anymore, but I do remember we had a nice little box set of these little books with these beautiful, lovely, charming illustrations, and I'm not entirely sure that I read them when I was 3, but I know I had them. I'm pretty sure they were read to me at some point, or I must have gone through them, at least, just through the pages to look at the pretty pictures. So I'm gonna go with those. Then my dad told me he would read to me The Cat in the Hat by Dr Seuss. So I'm going to go with that. And also The Grinch. I'm not sure that's the correct title. It's The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, something like that. What's funny about that is I thought I remembered seeing an animated version of Dr. Seuss. And they told me, no, we never saw any cartoons of that. So that's really funny. That's like, a distorted memory. No, apparently we had the picture books, and those were read to me. And I do remember the images. I remember the Beatles battling in bottles, but I thought it was animated. I thought I saw that on a television. I think that's funny, to see how memories get distorted over time. So that's for year 4. For year 5, I'm going to go with, I had this book. It was one of these thick cardboard books that had, you could press buttons and it would make a sound. And it was something to do with Bugs Bunny. I think the story was Bugs Bunny trying to escape from an island being pursued by Yosemite Sam or something. I loved Looney Tunes as a kid. And I remember that book. I remember the sounds it made. It was wild. I don't have it anymore, and I don't even remember its specific title, but I have a vivid memory of that book. Now on to childhood proper. Now for year 6, I decided to go with a classic now, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Now, I didn't realize that this came out in 1997. I was 5 when this came out. That seems insane to me. I don't know. My dad bought this, loved it, and I know for a fact that I was read this in English as a kid. Now, okay, in 97 I was 5, but I'm allowing for time to pass and my dad buying it a bit after the release date, and I'm going with they read this to me when I was 6. I would go on to pick them up in French and then finish them in English. And for year 7, I'm going to go with the Mr. Men series of books. I remember that I read them as a kid. They were so cute, and I wanted to collect all of them. I never read all of them, but I read a fair few of them. I don't know, 8, 9, 10, something like that. One of my English great aunts gave me a plushie of Mr. Happy. I don't have it anymore, but I still have a mug. I still have a mug with Mr. Happy on it. So yeah, the Mr. Men series. And then for year 8, well, I'm just going to go ahead with it and go with the Harry Potter series. I mean, like I said, I became a reader with a capital R around the age of 11. I did read a few children's book series, in the fantastical genre when I was younger than that, but I watched a lot of TV and cartoons for kids. I was more into that than actually sitting down with a book. But I did read the Harry Potter books, and I figured that in 6th grade, I was reading Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, which means I must have started reading the series a couple of years before that. I'm just going to go with Harry Potter for year 8. And then for year 9, well, I'm just going to go with the Chronicles of Narnia. We don't have any physical copies anymore in the household. We used to have a box set of the books in English, but we got rid of it. I read them in French. I had all 9 books in French, and I read them in French. Wait, is it 9 books? Sorry, all 7 books in French. And did I read them? Actually, did I read them in chronological order? That's a good question. I think I actually did. But yeah, when I was a kid, my great loves in life. So mythology, folk tales, fairy tales, fantastical creatures. I mean, this was the start of my love of fantasy, obviously. I loved dinosaurs. When I was a little kid, I wanted to be a paleontologist. Jurassic Park was my favorite movie, and I still consider it a classic to this day, and you won't change my mind about that. And then I went on to love birds, the natural descendants of dinosaurs, and I wanted to be an ornithologist. So dinosaurs, birds, mythology, fancy. Oh yeah, and Pokemon. Pokemon was the great love of my life as a child. I adored Pokemon. But why? Well, guess what? Because Pokemon are basically magical animals and plants, and based off of dragons and unicorns and ghosts and lots of fantastical elements with, I know now, also a lot of inspiration from Japanese folklore, so it all makes sense, really. So for year 10, I'm going to go with The Hobbit. I actually have I forgot to put... Now this is my English language copy of The Hobbit. This is not the one I read when I was 10. I read it in French the first time. It was a small little paperback copy. And then I wanted to reread it, and I was like, you've got to reread it in English. So I bought the illustrated edition to go with my other illustrated editions of Tolkien's works. So yeah, The Hobbit. There's again fantasy and a dragon. So an evil dragon, that I didn't like. But so that's going to bring us into puberty. And I said, I love dinosaurs, I love birds, I love Pokemon, all fancy stuff. And then that coalesced specifically into a budding love and budding adoration and obsession with all things dragon. Yes, dragons. I was so obsessed with dragons, and my godfather got wind of this, and someone he knew gave me this book, Eragon. Also, a very old copy. I don't know if you can see, but yeah, it's seen somewhere. Eragon by Christopher Paolini, the first book in the Inheritance cycle, the 4 books in total. And this was the first full-length novel I ever read in English. This is what launched me into the realm of being a bookworm and a lover of fantasy and reading in English, essentially, really, because I just could not find what I craved in French. Being an adult now, knowing what it's about, how it's structured, I know it's not the greatest thing of fantasy ever. I mean, it was written by a teenager, I think. He was like, what, 15 when he wrote this? So there's much better stuff out there, obviously, but it'll always have a special place in my heart. Plus, I loved the cover art. It's not my favorite design of dragon, but there's something about them. Then for year 12, so year 12 was not very good for me. I don't want to go into details, but let's say that mental ill health or mental illness, I'm not ashamed of using that word, is something that's kind of been a part of my life for a very long time, for more than half my life. And it really started to go downhill around the age of 10, 11, 12. And when I was 12, I spent time in a hospital for a couple of months. And when I was there, I devoured the Chronicles of Pern. Like I said, I was in my dragon phase. I'd read Eragon, and Dragon Riders was like, what? I want more of this. I want everything about relationships between humans and dragons. It was like the ultimate pet, or I mean, I don't even like the word pet anymore, but like relationship between a human and a non-human. And I got wind of these. I do realize they're adult science fiction books. At the time, well, I mean, when you read the first one, you don't really realize that it's science fiction. So you had these dragon riders, and then this awesome concept of, ooh, science fiction masquerading as fantasy. Didn't know you could do that. So I read the Chronicles of Pern. Not all of them, but at least 7 of them. And in fact, I plan on rereading them next year. And then for year 13, I picked another series very near and dear to my heart. It's His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. We have Northern Lights, followed by The Subtle Knife, and then concluded, or somewhat concluded now, in The Amber Spyglass. I have not read La Belle Sauvage, nor have I read The Secret Commonwealth yet. I plan on rereading these next year, and then reading the new trilogy, though I have heard it's not as good, but I'm a completionist. So I loved Harry Potter as a child. I would go nuts every time a movie came out. I devoured the books. I had a crap ton of stuff. But I do not consider myself today a Potterhead. That series will always have a special place in my heart. I have a lot of fondness towards it, but I'm not a Potterhead. I'm a Ravenclaw, and Ravenclaw pride forever, of course. But apart from that little bit, I'm not a Potterhead. I'm not obsessed with everything Harry Potter. And so when I read these, see, I'm more a fan of these than I am a fan of Harry Potter. This was like, I have found my thing as a younger person. I was like, this is my series, not Harry Potter. This is my crack. See, as a child and then a young teen, I was pretty isolated. I felt very different from others. Perhaps because I spent a lot of time around adults. I felt that perhaps intellectually speaking, at least, I was a bit more mature, a bit earlier. I'm not trying to brag here, that's just my perception of my personal life history. And I felt these were a bit more intelligent than Harry Potter. I don't think Harry Potter is dumb. There are lots of good themes, lots of things there to appeal to a lot of age categories, but these are more, they tackle some pretty heavy stuff, if you think about it, spiritual stuff or atheist stuff, and I feel like this is on my level when I was 13. I love the fact that there were like quotes from William Blake and Milton. I mean, introduce me to them and to William Blake especially. I love William Blake. So I love that, all the references to biblical stuff, mythological stuff. yeah, this was my crack. Not Harry Potter, this. Right, so here also not entirely sure it's perfectly accurate, but it's what I'm going with. For year 14, I'm going with these two. Mostly this one, but I'm throwing this one in too. So if you can't see, L'Enchanteur et la Nuit des Temps by the French author René Barjavel. René Barjavel is a science fiction French author, though L'Enchanteur is technically fantasy as it's a retelling of the Arthurian mythos. I had to read this for my third year of secondary school. That would be freshman year of high school. We had to read this for our literature class. Starting from freshman year, basically the language class where you have to learn grammar, orthography, etc. Well, it became a literature class. The teacher was awesome. One of the best teachers I've ever had. Love that guy. Passionate about what he did, and that's always the best. La Nuit des Temps. So I've never really found good SFF writing in French. Okay, I've never read Jules Verne. I probably should at some point in my life, but it's not planned for right away. Putting that aside, I've never really found any SFF worthy of my consideration in the French language, except for him, sort of. Nowadays, since I've changed a lot in my life with regards to the way I conceptualize romantic relationships and stuff like that. I think a lot of the themes he puts in his books would put me off a bit now. But at the time, I loved this. It was like, it appealed to my romantic spirit. And science fiction-wise, actually, it's a decent story. I say decent from my perspective now. I loved it at the time. Today, I don't think I would love it as much, but I would still recognize that it's a good sci-fi story overall. Quickly, I mean, it's about an expedition to Antarctica. You have Americans, Russians, Europeans. I mean, there's a bit of a Cold War vibe to it. And they find beneath the ice a city and two people in a capsule. And they learn that basically humans existed way before the dinosaurs reached exceptional levels of civilization. And then there was like a cataclysmic apocalyptic event that set evolution back to zero, basically. I mean, not terribly realistic if you think about it, but interesting premise, shall we say. And in fact, the apocalypse, the end of the world, is kind of a running theme in his books, because I've read 3 or 4 of them. Of his science fiction writing, this remains my favorite, but I mean, it was present in another few of his books. And you have this one, which I loved even more, but that's simply because it's about the Arthurian mythos. And it's a retelling of that, but from the point of view of Merlin, and then his one true love, his soulmate, Vivian, the Lady of the Lake, who's also a witch. And I really liked it also because the way it works in the novel, there is God, like the Christian monotheistic God, but then pagan gods also exist, and they're like lesser deities that work with the main big honcho god. So it's kind of trying to bridge paganism and Christianity, monotheism. Like they all work together and they're all part of the balance of the universe. So that was kind of nice in a way. So yeah. L'Enchanteur. Also, I like this thing about soulmates for reasons, but this was an important book in my life, so I had to mention it and squeeze it in somehow. So that was year 14. Moving on to post-puberty or adolescence proper. For year 15, I decided to select Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, a book I've reread this year. And so, why did I read this when I was 15? Well, one night I saw on the TV a French adaptation of the second version of the novel. It's a fairly explicit movie, and again, for reasons of personal life matters, this appealed to me a lot, the love story. I don't really understand why today. I mean, I know why, but it kind of blows my mind that I was ever in that mindset. But anyway, because I mean, I reread this year, like I said, and it was like, like, yeah, it's got important themes of social mores of the time and the loss of the English countryside to industrialization and the ravages of war on the psyche and the country. And I mean, there are lots of very relevant themes, don't get me wrong. I mean, it's a classic of literature for a reason. But I was like, yeah, but there's a lot of, I mean, okay, it's a running debate. I'm not going to go into it because I'm going to do a review. I thought it was quite sexist at times. My personal take on it anyway. And the love story did nothing for me whatsoever. So it was a big fat meh. But at the time, this was like, I considered one of my literary pillars for several years. And now it's like, nope, that's gone. Poof. That's not the case anymore at all. But it was very important in my life. It was a milestone in my reading life, in my personal life. So yeah, it had to be on this list for year 15. With this, I will put Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I've only ever read this once. I haven't reread this, but I probably should. I'm mentioning it because this is kind of what made me fall in love more so later on, but it opened the door for me into dystopian literature, which is a genre I really like, and probably not super good for me given my pessimistic nature. But I thought it was great at the time. And okay, so I read 1984 at the beginning of the year. From what I can remember of this, I prefer this over 1984. So for year 16, I also have 2 books. First, Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, which I've already mentioned on this channel. I reread it this year and a review is coming at some point. What attracted me to this when I was 16, again, has to do with personal, private life matters. Contrary to Lady Chatterley's Lover, though, I still love this. I mean, if you can love such a disturbing story, but I mean, it's beautifully written. It's a true work of literary art, as far as I'm concerned. So that was a great experience to reread it, though. I read it on a completely different level, with completely different points of reference. I love this for very different reasons than I had back when I was 16. But I also did appreciate, even back then, the exquisite writing, the intricacies of psychology and misdirection and unreliable narration. A very important book in my life, definitely, so obviously I was going to mention it. And then another one, I was really surprised to find that I'd read it that long ago. The Left Hand of Darkness, which I reread last week, and a review will definitely be coming. Oh, what a joy to reread this one. Quite simply. I can't actually say what I thought when I was 16. I really genuinely didn't think I'd read it that long ago. I thought I read it around the age of 18 or 19, I swear. So, yeah, obviously I'm going to put it then because I read it then. And obviously, I mean, yeah, I was going to mention Ursula K. Le Guin in my retrospective, and I'll shortly mention another book by her. I just didn't expect it to pop up so soon. In any case, yes, this is a gem of a book. It's kind of also a stand-in for my discovery of classic feminist science fiction and Le Guin's work. I mean, I love this little one. And then for age 17, I'm going to bring up The Mists of Avalon here. Oh, this beloved book. It was so important to me. It still is. At the time, I mean, when I was a teenager, I thought a lot about spirituality, what I believed, how I wanted to conceptualize it, what words I wanted to put onto my faith. But I went through a lot of research through paganism, neo-paganism, and there's links to my long, deeply rooted love of mythology, folklore, the fantastical, fantasy, and then with this strong, very strong feminist element, because it is basically a female-centered / feminist retelling of the Arthurian mythos. It made me take a deep dive into books that talked about the Arthurian mythos, and also magical historical fiction, reading about, I mean, I really enjoyed the historical elements, maybe not so much in this one, but like in The Forest House or Priestess of Avalon with the Romans and the Britons. Now, this is a very important book in my life. And then on a completely different note, this, The Delta of Venus by Anaïs Nin. So this is a French version. I really need to get an English language copy because I mean I have Little Birds to go with it, and it would be a Penguin Modern Classics edition, but I kind of feel attached to this one because it was a gift from someone I still have a lot of fondness for. This was my gateway into erotic literature. Basically, I read a lot of classic erotic literature and researched, erotic art and literature, and human sexuality is a subject that interests me. So it goes back to this basically. So it's an important book as well. And then again, somewhat unrelated, Les Fleurs du Mal by Charles Baudelaire. I read this in my junior year of high school for North Americans, so 5th year of secondary school. Now, in my country, the literature course for the 5th year has a strong element of poetic analysis in it. I wasn't actually tasked with reading this. It wasn't an assignment, but we had, like, all the students in the class had to do a compilation of poems around a central theme, and then you had to analyze some of them. Very creative exercise. I liked it. I mean, it was part of the final exam, so it was an important one as well. I chose the theme of suffering, and I must must have stumbled across Baudelaire somehow. But I bought this for myself. I didn't buy this for school. And this is beautiful, very dark as well. But darkness can be quite beautiful. I mean, there's a poem, this, I kid you not, about a rotting corpse. There's also a poem about forest. There's a poem entitled Destruction, about evil and suffering, which I put in my compilation. It's a masterful use of the French language and rich in symbolism. I mean, he was a symbolist, so it would make sense. It's a very important little book of poems to me. For year 18, I just have one book. Another Ursula K. Le Guin, The Birthday of the World and Other Stories. Most definitely my favorite short story anthology from her. I actually remember reading this on a school trip, like an extended school trip, and I read this on the bus, and it was amazing. To me, it epitomizes the mastery of Ursula K. Le Guin. I don't know, the stories in this really just touched me here and just transported me and made me think. And I was like, I devoured this. That's why I was also confused that I read The Left Hand of Darkness before reading this. Because I think this sent me like deep diving into Ursula K. Le Guin's science fiction writing. Because for the following 2, 3, 4 years, I read everything I could get my hands on by her. It's hard to explain, but this one is very, very special to me. And finally, for my last year as a teenager, year 19, I have 3 books again. Let's start with this one, Monsieur, by French author Emma Becker. It is the story of a relationship between a 20-year-old woman and a 50-year-old surgeon. It's actually supposed to be somewhat autobiographical. The author calls it autofiction. I picked it because, well, again, let's just say it had parallels to some of my own personal history. I also picked a non-fiction book for once, to change it up a bit. The Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton. My memory's a bit wonky because I thought I'd read a lot of my pagan-themed books when I was a teenager, but I guess I did read a lot of those. But maybe more to do with like Wicca and witchcraft. And then when I got out of high school, went to uni, I started reading about like neo-druidry and then shamanism. So this kind of both serves as a stand-in for all those books, as a doorway to those books, and as a bridge between the first lot of books that I read as a teenager and then the second and third lots I read as a young adult. It represents all of these books and this interest. I had and still have, but it's a bit more muted now. This, however, is more strictly speaking a historical book. It's a book about the history of the neo-pagan movement, really, in Great Britain specifically. So it's not actually a book about, you know, ritual magic or spiritual practice. It's a history book. It's very interesting, it's very informative. I mean, even if you have no interest spirituality-wise in neo-paganism, if you're just interested in the history of religions, I mean, this is a good book to pick, honestly. And then also kind of a stand-in for a selection of books, because I couldn't really choose any more specifically than that, is this, Delirium by Lauren Oliver. This is basically, if you want, my point of entry into the world of YA dystopian fiction, which I was really, really into for like my early 20s. And to be honest, I think it's, in a way, one of the best of all of them. I thought the premise was really original. The idea is that love, you kind of think that it's mostly romantic love, but actually it's all kinds of love is considered a disease, like a kind of neurological degenerescence. And people go through a surgical procedure once they are 18 years old to numb that bit of their brain that controls the feeling of love. What I liked also about that trilogy is that, you know, the end is less about who the girl ends up with, which is a bit different to the other dystopian trilogies I read. So it's kind of a stand-in for that literary period of my life, which brings us into my young adult years. Quite a few changes, big changes in my life took place during those years, which I assume is the case for a lot of people, in fact. Now, you all knew this was coming. Obviously, I was going to mention this at some point, right? Yes! Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire. I saw season 1 of the HBO series adaptation in 2012. Or maybe it was the end of 2011. Whenever it came out, I think I probably saw it a few months later. I saw that and I was like, ooh, tell me more! Tell me more! Went out and got the books. And it was the start of a long and extremely painfully frustrating at times love story between me and the Song of Ice and Fire universe. Right. That's out of the way. I will mention another one. Not so much important to me personally, although it is important to me as a feminist, as part of my feminist journey through life. It's this book, Delusions of Gender by Cordelia Fine. This is actually a pop science book, if you will. The idea is to debunk the science of brain sex, that, there is such a thing as a male or a female brain from birth. It looks at the evidence and, shows you that it's not really there, actually. And this it just put into, hard scientific fact data, a feeling I'd had ever since I was very young, a feeling which led me to identify with feminism. It also led me to read a lot of other books about feminism. So in that regard, it's a very important book in my library. It's one of the go-to books for me in that domain, basically. Now, for age 21, I don't have a fiction book to associate with it in any strong, specific way. I did read a lot of fiction, but nothing that I can point to as saying that that was a milestone in my reading life. So I just have a selection of non-fiction titles. First, I'm going to go with this one, Polyamory in the 21st Century. Now, I've read other books in the same vein since then. It's not necessarily my favorite about that particular subject. It's not necessarily because I consider myself polyamorous, but this book, it came at a time in my life where I was really thinking hard about relationships, about romantic relationships specifically, what I felt about it, how I wanted to plan my life. It just made me think a lot about these things. It struck a lot of, chords in me. I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I believe this. Maybe I am like that. Not specifically polyamorous, but questioning what some people call, the standard narrative or the life script. It helped put words to a lot of things I was thinking about, feeling. So in that respect, it's an important book in my life. Another book that kind of stands in for a selection of titles is this, Alex and Me by Dr. Irene Pepperberg. Now, this is the story, it's a memoir. It's also a science book, but it's a memoir. If you've never heard of him, he was Alex the Grey Parrot. He basically helped Dr. Irene Pepperberg show the world that we're not the only ones who understand language. She proved that parrots can use words with meaning, that they can actually understand what they're parroting back, and use words to make very, very simple sentences to express what they need, what they want. And this has, of course, been done with other species like chimps or gorillas. But this was a bird, debunking this idea of the bird brain, that birds are just flying morons. So that was revolutionary. Then, of course, I read a ton of books on ravens and crows because they're also my favorite bird group. I'm a bird nerd, if you didn't know. And not going to elaborate on this, but I had a parrot. And so, this also corresponded to a lot of things I was experiencing with my bird. For 2.5, 3 years, from 2014 to 2016, more or less, I read very, very little. Compared to the rest of my life before and then after, I had this dry spell of reading. I think I read 30 books spread out over 3 years, which for me is nothing. Even to this day, I'm not entirely sure why that happened, that I could go so long without the central joy of my life of reading. But thinking back, it corresponds to a very bad period of my life. Without going into too many details, I had issues at university with my health. I was put on a medication that didn't help my memory and concentration at all, entailing a few drastic changes in my life. And that went with a drastic reduction in reading. So for year 22, I did read 10, 12 books. And the clear winner of the selection was, The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. I read this before I read The Lord of the Rings. I'd read The Hobbit when I was a child, like I mentioned, then I'd reread it a few years before this. And then I decided to pick up The Silmarillion for some reason, not The Lord of the Rings. I guess I figured, because I'd seen the movies and my dad, who was a huge fan, said it was a really good adaptation. And I didn't feel the desire to read The Lord of the Rings, but I wanted to know more about the Tolkienverse. So I went to this. I love this. This was pure classical fantasy, excellent world building. And as much as I was somewhat disappointed by The Lord of the Rings, this I loved. And at the worst of these 3 years, year 23, I had next to nothing in my diaries about books. I mean, basically on my Goodreads page, that was very useful to use Goodreads to do this for the stats. It goes like 10, 12 in 2014, and then 2016, again 10-ish, 2015, 2. So this was really difficult. I had next to nothing to go on. I had something, so I'm just going to go with that. The Mortal Instruments series by Cassandra Clare. Like, there's nothing else I could even if I wanted to, there's nothing I can remember. I liked it. I really enjoyed this when I read it. I mean, I've probably outgrown it by now. I guess maybe the reason I did manage to read this was that it was like literary comfort food. You know, it was like YA, urban fantasy, easy to read, easy to get into. And in any case, like I said, I have nothing else to point to. So this has to be my pick for year 23. And then in 2016, my reading pace slowly started to pick up again. And the clear, shining title for my 24th year of life is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. That was the book of 2016 for me. No competition whatsoever. I read other books that were good and non-fiction books that I liked, but no, this is the book of 2016 for me. So that, thankfully, was an easy pick. So now we're on to my, let's say, fully adult years. First, for year 25. So again, a bit of personal information without going into too much detail. I stayed in the hospital for about 2 months in the spring of 2017. During that time, I read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. Now, I selected this specifically, but it also kind of serves as a stand-in for other psychiatry, mental illness-related memoirs, such as Girl Interrupted or Prozac Nation. But The Bell Jar, beautiful book, and I strongly identified with the main character and what she goes through in the book. Yeah, it was just a perfect reflection of my mood and my state of mind at the time. And then on to a slightly jollier note, maybe, certainly a weirder one. The Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer. Oh, how I love this trilogy. After the 3 years of darkness with regards to my reading, I mean, yes, there was The Handmaid's Tale, but then I came on to these, and I devoured them, and I obsessed over them, and trying to figure them out. And also, they opened the doorway to weird fiction, and then they kind of revived my love of science fiction, because I'd been perhaps more oriented towards fantasy than science fiction, apart from Ursula K. Le Guin's work during my teenage years. But then these made me want to seek out, well, weird fiction specifically, but weird science fiction, and then science fiction, and then I went on to read more classical science fiction, and now I really want to get into it. So these are very important to me on several levels. Then for year 26, last year. So it's kind of a tie between fiction and non-fiction. Fiction-wise, I'm going to take this one, The Gate to Women's Country by Sherry S. Tupper. It's kind of a stand-in pick. It stands in for all the classic feminist science fiction I chose to read last year. I read The Female Man, I read Herland, I read Women on the Edge of Time. And then I also read, like I said, a few books of, science fiction and weird fiction. I read Roadside Picnic, I read Solaris. I mean, it was the start of me seeking out science fiction lost books editions as well. So a rich year for my fiction reading, and especially science fiction or weird fiction, more than fantasy, I would say. And then non-fiction-wise, last year was devoted to psychedelic science. So this, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide by Dr. James Fadiman. Great resource book, really. And this is linked to the fact that, I have not the greatest history when it comes to mental health, and me just trying to think outside the box and trying to take care of myself. I binge subjects for some reason. Like, I'm gonna have a phase where I'm gonna read 5-6 books on feminism, 5-6 books on erotic art. Last year I binged psychedelic science. I read 6, 7, 8 books on the subject, I think. And this is clearly one of the best. It's a great resource. Everyone should start there, personally, I think. And then kind of co-winner, A Really Good Day by Eilert Waldman. And this is part science book and part memoir. This is about a woman, so she's actually an author, but she was also a lawyer, and she has a mood disorder. Basically, she tried microdosing LSD to treat her mood disorder, and it kind of worked. It gave me hope, and this gave me hope, and that's a very precious commodity, I think. And finally, this year, my 27th year on this earth. Reading-wise, I haven't read as much as last year or in 2017 because my summer was very bad, let's put it that way. So I actually had a hard time selecting a book for this year. I guess ultimately I will go with two. First, it's kind of a weird pick for me, honestly. But, well, basically these guys, The Lord of the Rings. I mean, I picked it because it's an important milestone in my reading life. I thought to myself, there's no way around it. You will read The Lord of the Rings at least once in your life, so help me God. I'm picking it for that reason, basically, because I achieved that goal. It's weird for me to pick it because it unfortunately is associated with this horrible thing that happened this summer, and my reading experience was not as good one, partly because of that, and partly because I was slightly disappointed by my reading these. It's unfortunately a tarnished experience. I don't really feel good selecting. I kind of have to select them, but it doesn't feel that good, to be honest. But then, this year didn't feel that good, so actually perhaps, it fits perfectly. However, I do want to end it on a more positive note, and thankfully I do have a good selection for that. It's probably the best book I've had the pleasure of reading. That wasn't a reread, okay? Like, the best new book I've read this year was this. This is not a published, yes, it's published. You can't find it in bookstores, basically. This was funded through Kickstarter, an art book written by an Italian artist based in Scotland, and this is a book about witches. It's female-centered, it's feminist, it's pagan, it's nature-based, it's spiritual, it's lovely, it's beautiful. This is exactly what I needed, basically, after the summer. It was a much-needed bit of soothing balm for my soul, let's put it that way. This is the book for year 27. Though, like I said, I reread a few books and I've had great rereads. I reread The Mists of Avalon, I reread The Left Hand of Darkness, so obviously those were amazing books, but I've already associated them with previous years, so I couldn't pick them again. And I did it! I hope it was interesting. I certainly think it was interesting for me, if nothing else. It was an interesting exercise. Have you read any of the books I mentioned? I'd love to hear your thoughts about them, and I invite you to... it's not really a tag video. It's not a tag originally. I just thought it was a cool idea for a video, but if you've done something similar, I'd be interested in watching. And yeah, that's it for now. I hope you all have a lovely day or evening, and I shall see you in the next video.